Hello and welcome to the channel. I am William Gwynne and today I'll be talking about my previous 10 5-star reads. So yes, I'll be talking about some of my recent favourites, all the books that I attributed 5-star reads for, often for different reasons. And I'll be going from my most recent favourite to the one furthest back. So yes, as I said, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's in the title. The previous 10 books I gave 5 stars to, and these will span quite a few months back, and yes, across quite a few genres as well. So hopefully you enjoy or are interested or intrigued by at least a few of the books that I mentioned today. Please do let me know in the comments any books that you've enjoyed that I mentioned, any that are similar, and any that you would recommend. So first up, I have A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Of course, this is the third installment of A Song of Ice and Fire, otherwise known as A Game of Thrones. So yes, I've read A Storm of Swords very recently, and I was a bit surprised by the first half because one of George R. R. Martin's strengths is how his different POVs, and he has many of them, how they weave in and out of each other's stories. And I thought for the first half, first 300-400 pages, that didn't really happen. So it took me a bit by surprise, and they're often my favourite moments. But then this second half, and a half is basically the size of a normal book when it comes to A Song of Ice and Fire. So yes, the latter 500 pages were absolutely extraordinary in every single way. The pure quantity of quality characters who are so memorable, and they feel so vivid and unique, and they feel like fully fleshed characters, not just the POVs, but everyone surrounding them. It's just extraordinary. And yes, there was just event after event, surprise after surprise, and it just floored me. It's absolutely breathtaking, the amount of twists and turns and surprises, all of which they're linked, and there's little pieces that you could put together along the way, but I just failed to do any of them. They're very hard puzzles, and when you have that revelation, you are just astounded. And often in a book, if there's a big revelation, you're like, wow, it's them who did it. But in this, you're like, but is that revelation actually true? Is that who did it? Or is there going to be another twist later on? And there's just another element added to this story where the truth is often very vague, and sometimes you do not even ever find out what the truth is. You only have guesses. And yeah, I absolutely love that. It adds another element of realism, which is often just a miss in books. And yeah, of course, it's so hard to place that amongst everything going on in a book, but George R. R. Martin is such an efficient writer, and yeah, he did a brilliant job with this. And you may see that this book is slightly chewed up, which is absolute blasphemy, but our puppy chewed it, so yeah, I must have some vengeance. But yeah, that is A Storm of Swords. Next up, I have All Things Wise and Wonderful by James Herriot. So this is a collection of autobiographical short stories which were written in the 1960s, I believe, and it is the author, James Herriot, who is a vet, looking back on his days in Darrowby, his early career in the 1930s. And book one is All Creatures Great and Small, and it finishes with a wedding, and this is following that, but before World War II starts, or before he is called up to service. So it's kind of in that little period in between, and it's absolutely lovely. This one was... There's some more serious tones played into this one, and of course it's autobiographical, writing about these true stories, and there's obviously that element of war lingering in the background. And so yeah, there were some extra serious tones in this book, but it still maintained that heartwarming feeling that was just really lovely to read and encounter in a book. Most of the books I read are just dark and bleak and depressing. I'm currently reading Dreaming the Eagle by Amanda Scott, which is absolutely incredible. I mean, she is a master of her craft, but it is stressful, and Dreaming the Eagle is absolutely tragic and heartbreaking. But there were heartbreaking moments, but All Things Wise and Wonderful also has those moments that are just so happy, and the overall tone is just that is relaxing and warming. It makes me just want to go sit outside with my animals and just hug them and just spend some time with them. And yeah, it's just a lovely experience. I'd highly recommend these. They're autobiographical, but they're written in a style which is very readable and accessible, and they feel like fiction. But yeah, it's lovely knowing that it's also a true story. Obviously, I'm an animal lover, so of course I'm going to love reading these books. They're all about the animals, and James Herriot, I wish I knew him. I wished I lived in Darrowby in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's a bit of a love letter to the place and the people and the profession, which is absolutely lovely. So yeah, this is a heartwarming read that I would recommend to anyone who needs a break from the dreariness, which is 99% of books. Next up, I have Babel by R.F. One. So this is her most recent release, and I believe it is going to just be a standalone. It ends here, but I don't know. Maybe she picks up with one or two characters in another. But yes, at the moment, it is a standalone, and I absolutely loved it, hence why it's in this list and hence why I gave it 5 stars. This is historical fantasy at its finest. The premise is that we are in the Victorian period in the 19th century, and we follow a boy of Chinese descent who is born and lives in Canton, and then his family die of an illness, and a mysterious professor turns up and agrees to be his adoptive father and takes him to England on the condition that this boy studies very hard and goes to Oxford to join the translation branch, which is called Babel. And so, yeah, it's very interesting. And we have a very intimate story at the core of this, where the boy then goes to Oxford, and it's like a fairy tale, a dream come true. He absolutely loves to study. He loves the resources. He finally has a sense of belonging as he's thrust into this new world with people who are also thrown into it with him, and they all kind of lean onto each other and they hold on to each other during this storm, which is this storm of change. And yeah, it's really lovely in that aspect. But we have an amazing story that shows internal conflict, where, as I said, it is a fairy tale. He loves studying, but the fantastical element comes into play in a way which it facilitates the strength and power of the British Empire and their assimilation and dominance of other cultures around the world. And so we have this conflict of identity and conflict of conscience as well, where loving to study and aid this, but hating what it facilitates and seeing what the British Empire does. And so, yeah, it's really interesting in that way. As I said, it's historical fantasy. I won't say much more about the fantastical elements, because that is part of the joy of reading this, seeing those unfold and learning the mysteries of this world, which is our own in so many ways, but different in others. I've done a review for Babel, which is on the channel, and I also talked about the power of language in 2 ways, as the magic is fueled by language, but also how Ara Kwang uses her prose, her writing style, absolutely brilliantly to eke out the finer moments of this story. So yeah, that is Babel. Brilliant book. Absolutely loved it. It's been a phenomenon of 2022. Thousands upon thousands of people have been raving about it, and I've loved it. And I am very happy and proud to be joining those ranks. Next up, no surprise, some more George R.R. Martin. A Clash of Kings, Book 2 of A Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, I read A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords very close together. Despite them being absolute beasts of books, they are very easy to read, and I absolutely loved it. Again, as I said, so I really enjoyed the Game of Thrones. 5 stars, absolutely great. I loved all the twists and turns and what unique fantasy it is. And obviously, as a younger reader, I was born after a Game of Thrones was released, so I've read a lot of more modern fantasy, and it's very interesting looking at it from a different perspective than most people, because I'm seeing all these books which Game of Thrones is similar to, and of course it wasn't inspired by those other books, it has inspired them. And so yeah, it's really interesting going back to kind of the roots of the inspiration for so many modern authors. And of course, the Game of Thrones has been a phenomenon in the book world and the TV world. And so yeah, it's very interesting seeing where all these ideas and kind of breaking of tropes came from. And I know George R. R. Martin wasn't the first to set out to do this kind of style fantasy, which is basically real life if there were dragons. But many would argue that he has done the finest job of that. I know I watched a review of A Game of Thrones by Mike's Book Reviews a few days ago. Absolutely brilliant. He really captured what I love about A Game of Thrones, and it was really interesting just hearing what he was saying, how it changed fantasy when he was reading it, what it did differently. So if you kind of want to hear at that time what people were thinking of A Game of Thrones and how it kind of breaks away from some of the tropes and structures and forms of fantasy at that time, definitely go and head over and watch that review of A Game of Thrones. Really great. It's a great channel, and of course brilliant review. And yeah, that is A Clash of Kings. Much of the same of what I said with A Storm of Swords. The strength is the characters and the twists and the turns and this vivid world. I'd say other than Tolkien, no one has created a world with so much history that is just brimming with life, and I absolutely love it. Next up, I have some historical fiction, and this is The Wolf Sea by Robert Lowe. So this is book 2 of The Oathsworn, and this is kind of a Norse series, so it's, as I said, historical fiction. We're following a Scandinavian and Norse group of warriors. And book 1, which is called The Whale Road, I liked, but I thought there were major flaws. I really liked how we got into the mindset of these characters, but it was to such an extent that there was no one that I liked. But in book 2, I really liked how it maintained that kind of authenticity, but at its core, as a group of warriors, a group of characters who will fight and die for each other, and adding that element of morality as well, which, whilst it didn't change what their priorities are and their way of living, I think Robert Lowe really struck a great balance of giving you some likable attributes as well, that they would die for each other, and there's that selfless aspect to some of them. So yeah, I really liked how that was more added into the mix. And Robert Lowe is, even though I've only read The Well Road and The Wolfsea, and one I liked and the other I gave 5 stars to, so I really liked, I'd still say that he is one of the finest authors at dialogue in any genre that I've had the pleasure of reading. The unique characters and perspectives of characters really comes across in the dialogue. And yeah, really, if anyone is an aspiring writer or budding writer, I would really highly recommend reading these to try and get a feel for how Robert Lowe really ekes out those personality traits in the dialogue. I was absolutely astounded. It felt like I was there listening to real conversations, and the way he writes as well is very seamless, very organic, natural. And yeah, he's a great writer. And Bernard Cornwell says on the front, a company of warriors, desperate battles, and enthralling reads. So yeah, if Bernard, he knows what he's talking about. So yeah, exactly. I agree with that. The Wolfsea is worth a read. Next up, I have my first reread that I have on the list, and perhaps the only reread I have on the list, and that is The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. One of, if not my favourite books of all time, barring Papa Gwynne's books, of course. But yes, so this is essentially a history of Middle-earth, and I'm not one of these people who gets enraged if people talk about against the Silmarillion, because even though I absolutely adore it, I can see it's not everyone's cup of tea. I love stats, I love facts, I love histories, I love family trees, all of that stuff, and The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien has that in abundance in every single way. So of course, this was going to be something I absolutely loved. I love Lord of the Rings, and I love everything I just mentioned. So it all comes together in a boiling pot of just brilliance, of perfection. But yeah, I totally understand if people don't enjoy it. I'd say the first chapter I find quite dry, but after that, I love how this is a collection of short stories telling of the creation and evolution of the world of Middle-earth, and it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Arda, I absolutely love being in this place, and I like the stories of Beren and Luthien to Turin to Rumba, the Children of Hurin, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. There's such a wide range here where you have a tiny bit of comedy, not too much, but it is there, in my opinion at least, to some romance and a whole load of tragedy. I cry a lot whenever I read this, and yeah, for good reason in my opinion. I think that there's a lot of my favourite characters of all time are in this, and considering that a lot of them don't have too much page time, it shows what a masterful writer J.R.R. Tolkien is, especially considering this is his history. This isn't even his main work, which is of course The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. That's what people see as his main work nowadays. But yeah, The Silmarillion, absolutely love it. If you've enjoyed The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, I highly recommend checking this out, learning a bit more about the past, many events that are mentioned in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And so it's great to kind of have that background and many, many more stories in Middle-earth. You can never have too many stories from Middle-earth or from J.R.R. Tolkien. Next up, I have some more historical fiction, and that is Essex Dogs by Dan Jones. He is a very well-known and renowned author of non-fiction, and this is his debut historical fiction work, and it came out in 2022. I was very lucky to have access to an early copy, and I absolutely loved it. I've got a review with my brother over on The Brothers Gwynne if you want to check out my in-depth thoughts on this book, but in short, absolutely loved it. This is very unique historical fiction which centres on the early years of the Hundred Years' War, which, if you don't know, is a war between England and France during the medieval period. And I absolutely loved how this focuses on many of the aspects of warfare which are not really touched upon anywhere else. The grueling marches, the occupation of abandoned towns and villages, the little groups of mercenaries and the warriors and their different motivations. The romanticism of war is just completely stripped away. We are disillusioned from that kind of aspect of warfare, which is so commonly presented, especially when it's about the medieval period. We often see in our mind's eye, or at least I did anyway, kind of Arthur, not chivalry, all of that stuff. And whilst there are a few patriots in this, most of them are just there to survive, to make some money, and to they're all just preserving their own life, and it's all about self-preservation. But amongst all of that depravity and warfare and brutality, we also have heart, which I think is very important, that whilst we see these darker elements of humanity, that there needs to be heart at the core of the story, something that is engaging you, someone you're rooting for. And in this, Dan Jones does a great job of having the group, the Essex Dogs, as the core of that. So there's 7 or 8 people, and they are there to make money, but they care about each other. I'll read the back.
Some men fight for glory, others fight for coin. The Essex Dogs fight for each other.
And therein lies the brilliance of this book. Whilst it's showing all the historical elements of this war, and we're really building to this kind of culmination of events at the end, it shows some terrible things that unfold, but we're still rooted in the story, and we still care about the outcome because of these characters at the core, because they care for each other and they will sacrifice things of their own to help those around them. So yeah, that I really like that kind of contrast, that balance there, that Dan Jones, I forgot his name for a second there, how terrible. They balance that Dan Jones struck, and I'm really looking forward to book 2 of this series. All right, next up, only 3 to go. Some more historical fiction, that is Sword of Kings by Bernard Cornwell, the penultimate installment of the Saxon Stories, otherwise known and more commonly known now as the Last Kingdom series, as it has been adapted onto Netflix. But in the book, only book 1 is called The Last Kingdom, and the series as a whole is called The Saxon Stories. And this is a 13 installment series, so it's pretty hefty, but it's one that you can easily read 1 a month, and there's not too much you have to remember. It's some of the middle books follow a bit of a template, which I still enjoy, but it means that you don't have to binge read them, and there's not really cliffhangers. So it's great that you can just slowly but surely get through this series, and that's what I've been doing. So yes, this penultimate installment. I love how in every single book, Bernard Cornwell somehow finds a way for Uhtred to experience more growth. Uhtred, son of Uhtred of Bebbanburg, is an incredible main character that drives this story, and he's our sole perspective. It's a chronicler's tale. He is old now, and he is telling us of his past. And so Sword of Kings penultimate installment, really great. He's quite old now, Uhtred, but he's still a warrior, and it's showing that he has to use his mind more, but also the weight of his oaths weigh heavily on his shoulders. When he was young, he could do it, but now he knows he hasn't got much time left, and he feels the pressure, the duty that to know that when he dies, he has left his family safe. And so, yeah, as I said, that weighs heavily on his shoulders. And there's still this conflict of identity. He was born a Saxon, raised a Dane, and that's continued throughout the whole series, as of course we have Alfred the Great and the people of Wessex trying to unite all of England and get rid of the Danes, but Uhtred has a foot in both camps. And I absolutely love how, whilst that conflict of interest and conflict of identity has spanned over all these books, there are ways that it's been made fresh. And yeah, I think Bernard Cornwell does a great job. And I think the book before this, the 11th book, I was really disappointed with. I thought that there was usually, whilst it follows a template, there are some awesome and unique sequences. But in the installment before, I was disappointed there wasn't any. But this really redeemed it more than it needed to. And I absolutely love this. It's 5 stars, so I need to stop saying that. It's pretty self-explanatory. That's why the video is called what it is. And so, yeah, that is Sword of Kings. I highly recommend if you want some accessible historical fiction, or if you're getting back into it, or if you just want an easy read. And yeah, that one that is engaging with great characters at the core of it. Now some historical fantasy, and this is The Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless, another book that I have reviewed with my brother on the Brothers Gwynne. So as I said with the Essex Dogs, the same applies here. If you're interested in hearing some more in-depth thoughts, please do check out that review. I'll have it pop up if I remember, if I'm techie enough to do that. But so this is historical fantasy set in the very late 10th century, and it is inspired by history and Irish mythology, and I absolutely love the balance that Shauna Lawless crafts here. I think this is a brilliant book. We have 2 POVs, 2 women. Of course, this is a time of patriarchal society dominated by those patriarchal hegemonic values, and so these 2 women, they have to strive for agency through the men around them, and I absolutely love that we have to question the motivations of these characters. It's not self-explanatory like a lot of books. It's not just given to you on a plate. That some of these characters, they say that they're doing things for their families or their children, so on and so forth. But we question, is that really the motivation? And I really love there is that extra layer to the characters. And this is a character-driven story. It's set in Ireland, as I said, inspired by Irish mythology, and we've We've got the Norse element in here, as I said, with a Sword of Kings as well, and I absolutely love that. I love that period of history, and I love how it's playing into this historical fantasy element as well. I won't say too much about the fantastical elements because that's one of the reasons I love reading this, is really experiencing those moments firsthand without any spoilers. And so yes, I would not spoil it for anyone else. I highly recommend this. One of, if not my favorite release of 2022. I absolutely love The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, and I thought Shauna Lawless did an absolutely brilliant job presenting this world that felt authentic, and it had a wide cast of characters with a varied array of character traits and personalities. And so yeah, it felt very vivid, very real. The world felt like a living, breathing space. And yeah, really loved this, and it has stuck with my mind, and I loved it at the time, and somehow it is just growing and growing on me the longer I leave it. And so yes, when book 2 is released next year, I will definitely have this in for a reread. And last up, I'm sorry if I've been talking too long at you all, but this is the last one, and it is Until the Last by Mike Shackle. This is the third and final installment to The Last War, and it's absolutely brilliant. I loved We Are the Dead, I loved A Fool's Hope, and this finale is absolutely incredible when held up to those very high hopes that I had. So the premise of the beginning of this series is, what if the bad guys won? I always say, what if Sauron won and he took the Shire? What would happen? And so the premise of this is that the good guys have lost, and most of the first book takes place in one city, and we're following some people who are part of a resistance, some who are hunting the resistance, and those who are just kind of dragged into events against their own will. And so of course this is continuing in the story, and this is grander than the first book, but of course it has evolved in that way. And I love how, whilst it has evolved into a very different story, that Mike Shackle maintains those intimate elements that really made me love We Are the Dead. And we've still got incredible characters. It's very, very fast paced. Every chapter there's kind of a key event that it centers around. Not always action, but something that is really engaging. And the creation of this book is absolutely brilliant, where this is not a small book. It must be 700 pages, close to that anyway. Yep, over 700 pages, but it feels like such a quick read. I remember Mike's book review said about Papa Gwynne's The Faith and the Fallen, that whilst they're big books, they are so easy to read. You can just binge read them. They've got that factor about them. And I would say the same about The Last War. And I'd highly recommend this series by Mike Shackle. And it's finished now. It's concluded. So you can buy all 3 books in one and get through them all. So yeah, what reason not to get into this? And so there we go. They are my previous 10 5-star reads. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you enjoyed me just talking about some of my favourite books and rambling on about them. But please do let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if you know any books that are similar that I may enjoy. And let me know anything else in the comments. I'll be happy to talk to you down there. And as I said, check out those reviews that I've done on the Brothers Gwynne or any other videos on my channel where I talk about these books. Please do let me know also if there's any videos you would like me to cover on the channel, or if there's any of these books you'd like me to do a dedicated review for. I'd be more than happy to do that if you're interested. But everyone, thank you so much for watching, and stay safe.